The sun over New Mexico in the late 1870s was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, a forge, an anvil that beat the life out of the land until it was cracked and gasping. In the town of Prosperity, the dust was a living entity. It rose in ghostly swirls with every gust of wind, settled in a fine red film on every windowsill, and coated the back of a man's throat with the taste of grit and failed dreams. The buildings, raw timber structures bleached gray by the relentless light, huddled together along a single wide street as if for protection against the vast, indifferent expanse of the sun-scorched plains that stretched to the horizon. Beyond them, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains stood like silent, crimson-hued judges, their peaks sharp against a sky of impossible, searing blue. This was a place where life was pared down to its essentials: water, work, and the weight of the Colt peacemaker that hung from nearly every man's hip. It was a weight of both security and constant, simmering threat. The law, in the form of a paunchy, sweat-stained sheriff named Bartholomew, was more concerned with maintaining a fragile peace than dispensing true justice. In Prosperity, a man's reputation was his currency, and a woman's was a fragile treasure, easily shattered. And Elena Morse had just been ground into the very dust she now stood in. She stood before the austere facade of the town's only church, a small bundle of her meager possessions clutched in her hands. Her dress, a plain, dark wool garment that was far too warm for the season, was the last vestige of her life within the convent walls just outside of town. It was the only home she had ever known, an orphan left on their doorstep as an infant. She had been raised by the stern, black-robed sisters, her world defined by the scent of beeswax and incense, the cool stone floors, and the rhythmic cycle of prayers. But that world had cast her out. She was 19. Her beauty was not the delicate, powdered kind found in the saloons or the prim, corseted variety of the town's few respectable ladies. It was the beauty of a wildflower that manages to bloom in arid soil, unrefined, resilient. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe bun, but rebellious strands had escaped to frame a face of honest plains and a dusting of freckles across her nose. Her hands, though clean, were chapped from lye soap and hard labor. It was her eyes, however, that held the heart of her story. They were the gray of a gathering storm, and in their depths churned a tempest of confusion, hurt, and a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. The whispers followed her like flies to a wound. Impure, they hissed. The word passed from the tight-lipped wives of merchants to the leering ranch hands loitering outside the general store. The accusation had come from Father Michael himself, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips. He had spoken of her willful spirit and her unseemly pride. He had condemned her for questioning his authority, for refusing to show the proper, docile humility he demanded of the young women in his charge. Elena knew the truth. His guidance had become cloying. His private blessings held a little too long. His hand on her arm a little too firm, when she had finally pulled away, her eyes flashing with a clear and silent no. He had seen not a frightened girl defending her dignity, but a sinner revealing her tainted heart to the cloistered world of the convent and the pious hypocrites of the town. His word was gospel. Hers was the hiss of a serpent. She was judged, condemned, and exiled, all without a trial. Her virtue, the only thing she owned, had been stolen by a lie. Now, she was adrift in a world she was never prepared for. The men who passed her didn't look at her with respect. Their eyes stripped away her drab dress and saw only the brand the priest had put upon her. The women looked through her, their faces masks of righteous contempt, as if her presence might contaminate their own fragile standing. She was a pariah, a ghost haunting the edges of a society that had already buried her. It was into this tableau of silent, brutal judgment that Cole Hartman rode. He sat atop a powerful bay stallion, a horse whose sleek coat and fine leather tack spoke of wealth as clearly as a signed banknote. Cole himself was an extension of that power. He was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape around him, tall and broad-shouldered. He wore his clothes dusty jeans, a plain linen shirt, and a worn leather vest with an unconscious authority. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that was more compelling than handsome. It was a map of hard miles and harder decisions, tanned by the sun, with the lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. They were cold, assessing, and deeply weary. Cole Hartman owned the Circle H, a sprawling cattle empire that was the lifeblood of the entire region. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear, envy, and grudging respect. He was known for his sharp mind, his unyielding will, and a temper that, once roused, was as devastating as a flash flood. He had seen his share of violence, betrayal, and the soft, cloying traps women could set. He'd had liaisons, of course women in towns from here to Santa Fe, who were drawn to his power and his money like moths to a flame. But each encounter had only deepened his cynicism, reinforcing his belief that love was a fool's game, a transaction dressed up in pretty words. He trusted his horse more than he trusted any person, and his heart was a fortress, long since sealed against any potential siege. He was riding back from a cattle deal in Socorro, his mood as foul as the cheap whiskey they'd served at the negotiating table. He hated coming into prosperity. The town was a cesspool of petty gossip and grasping ambition. As he guided his horse down the main street, his gaze swept over the familiar scene, and then it stopped. He saw the girl. He took in the whole miserable picture in a single, practiced glance: the convent dress, the small bundle, the way she stood ramrod straight as if bracing for a physical blow. He saw the look she was getting, the snickering men, the disdainful women. He'd seen scenes like this before. A girl gets in trouble, the church throws her out, and the wolves start circling. It was a tale as old as the dust. His first instinct was to ride on. It was none of his business. He had enough problems managing 10,000 head of cattle and 50 ornery cowboys without borrowing a stranger's. He was about to spur his horse forward when he saw her face clearly for the first time. He saw past the fear and the shame in her eyes and recognized the bedrock of defiance beneath it. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. She was enduring, her chin held at an angle that was both proud and profoundly vulnerable. Something in that expression snagged his attention, a discordant note in the predictable, sordid song of the town. He reined in his horse, letting it stand in the middle of the street, an island of quiet power in the sea of judgment. He watched as the town's self-appointed jury, in the form of 3 lanky, jobless cowhands, decided to move from whispers to action. "Well now, look what the good Lord's provided," one of them drawled, stepping in front of Elena. He was young, with a cruel mouth and an unearned swagger. "A little lost lamb. You need someone to show you the way. Little lamb." His 2 companions chuckled, spreading out to flank her, cutting off any retreat. Elena flinched but didn't speak. She hugged her bundle tighter to her chest, her knuckles white. "Leave me be," she said, her voice low but clear. "Oh, she's got a voice," the second one sneered. "I hear you ain't so pure anymore. Maybe you'd like some company that ain't so holy." The leader reached out, his grimy hand intending to grab her arm. It was the moment Cole's weary indifference finally fractured. It wasn't chivalry that moved him. It was a deep, abiding disgust for bullies. He had no time for men who found their strength in preying on the weak. It was an inefficient and distasteful display. Without raising his voice, he spoke. His words cut through the hot, still air with the chilling finality of a cocking hammer.
"That's far enough. Boys!"
The 3 men froze. They turned slowly, their bravado evaporating when they saw who had spoken. The name Hartman carried more weight in this territory than a federal decree. Cole didn't move from his saddle. He didn't need to. He just looked at them, his icy gaze moving from one man to the next, weighing and dismissing them. "She doesn't want your company," Cole stated, his tone flat, leaving no room for argument. "Move along." The leader's face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and fear. He opened his mouth to protest, to salvage some scrap of his pride, but the words died in his throat. He saw the utter lack of emotion in Cole's eyes and knew, with a primal certainty, that this was not a man to be tested. He and his friends muttered something under their breath and shuffled away, melting back into the shadows of the boardwalk. The street fell quiet again, save for the creak of Cole's saddle and the whisper of the wind. He turned his attention back to Elena. Her face was pale, her stormy eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She had been saved from jackals only to find herself at the mercy of a wolf. He was a different kind of man, more dangerous by far, because his power was real. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, the jingle of his spurs a sharp, metallic sound in the sudden silence. He stood before her, his height and breadth casting a long shadow that enveloped her completely. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked. The question was a formality, his voice a low rumble, devoid of warmth but not entirely unkind. Elena could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She stared at the solid column of his chest, unable to meet his gaze. She could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the scent of leather, horse, and the clean, sharp air of the open range. It was overwhelmingly male, a presence so potent it seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. Just then, the church doors opened. Father Michael emerged, flanked by Sheriff Bartholomew. The priest pointed a condemning finger at Elena. "She is no longer welcome in the house of the Lord, or within the decent confines of this town," he announced, his voice ringing with sanctimonious authority. "Let her walk in the wilderness, her sins have earned her." Sheriff Bartholomew shifted his weight, his eyes avoiding Cole's. "The town council agrees. Cole, for the sake of public decency, she has to go." Cole's gaze flickered to the priest, a flicker of contempt so cold it was almost imperceptible. Then he looked at Elena, truly looked at her. He saw a girl who had known nothing but walls, now being cast out into a world with no walls at all, a world that would devour her before the sun set. He had a choice. He could turn, mount his horse, and ride away. He could leave her to the fate the town had decreed. It was the smart thing to do, the easy thing. His life was complicated enough, but as he looked at her standing there, a solitary, defiant weed in a garden of pious poison, his own long-dormant code of conduct stirred. He didn't deal in justice, and he sure as hell didn't deal in charity, but he would not abide a rigged game, and this was the most rigged game he'd ever seen. He watched as Elena finally turned her back on the church, on the town, on the only life she had ever known. She took a step, then another, her small figure starting the long, lonely walk out of prosperity, heading toward the vast, unforgiving plains that shimmered under the brutal afternoon sun. She was walking toward her own destruction, and Cole Hartman, against every cynical, world-weary instinct he possessed, found that he could not let her go alone. The dust kicked up by her worn-out shoes was a fine, choking powder. Each step Elena took away from prosperity felt like a step off the edge of the known world. The sun was a physical weight on her shoulders, and the vast, silent plains ahead promised nothing but a slow, lonely demise. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to move, to put distance between herself and the contemptuous eyes of the town. Her life had been reduced to this one desperate act of walking. A shadow fell over her, long and sudden, the rhythmic beat of a horse's hooves, slow and deliberate, sounded just behind her. Her heart leaped into her throat. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The sheer force of his presence had been burned into her senses. She stopped, her back rigid, and waited. Cole Hartman reined in his bay, bringing it to a halt beside her. He looked down from his saddle, his face impassive, shadowed by the brim of his hat. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze taking in her small, isolated figure against the immense, indifferent landscape. She looked like a lost child, yet she held herself with the dignity of a queen facing a firing squad. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked finally. His voice wasn't harsh, but it held a practical, non-negotiable edge. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Away from here." "Away from here is nowhere," he stated, a simple fact. "There's nothing but rock and rattlesnakes for 50 miles in that direction. You won't last the night." She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "That is my concern." A flicker of something, impatience, or perhaps grudging respect, crossed his face. "You're making it my concern. I don't like finding skeletons on the edge of my property. It's bad for the cattle and it creates paperwork." His bluntness was like a splash of cold water. There was no pity in his words, no kindness. It was a raw, unvarnished assessment of a problem. Her problem. She finally turned to look up at him, her gray eyes meeting his without flinching. "What do you want from me?" "I want to not have to deal with your corpse in the morning," he said flatly. He swung a leg over his saddle and dismounted, landing with a soft thud of boots in the dust. He was even taller on the ground, a mountain of a man who blocked out the sun. "I have a ranch a few miles from here. You can have a roof over your head for the night." Elena's mind reeled. The sisters at the convent had filled her head with stories, dire warnings about men like this, men of power and wealth who lived by their own rules, who took what they wanted without a thought for piety or consequence. A roof over her head. What would be the price of such a thing? Her body, the one thing she had managed to defend from Father Michael, was all she had left to sell. The thought sent a wave of nausea and shame through her. "I have no money to pay you," she said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. Cole's gaze was steady, unnervingly direct. "I didn't ask for money." "Then what do you ask for?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. She was bracing herself for the inevitable, crude proposition. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, his expression changed. The cold mask cracked, and she saw a deep, profound weariness in his eyes, a cynicism that went bone deep. He seemed to understand her fear, and it irritated him. "Listen to me, girl," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I am offering you shelter because I don't want to watch a person die of thirst and stupidity. That's all. In the morning, you can work for your keep or you can walk away. I don't care which, but you're not dying on my doorstep. Now, are you getting on this horse or are you going to stand here until you bake to the ground?" He gave her no time to argue. He took the small bundle from her hands and tied it to his saddle horn. Then he cupped his hands to give her a step up. His touch on her ankle was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time a man had touched her with anything other than aggression or unwanted intimacy. This was different. It was functional, efficient. She found herself seated in front of him on the wide saddle, her back pressed against the solid wall of his chest. He swung up behind her with an easy grace, and suddenly she was enveloped by him. His arms came around her to take the reins, caging her in. The heat of his body soaked through the thin wool of her dress. She held herself perfectly still, barely breathing, her senses overwhelmed. The world, which moments before had been a terrifyingly open space, had shrunk to the circle of this man's arms. The ride was silent. The only sounds were the creak of the leather and the steady plod of the horse. Elena stared straight ahead, watching as the landscape transformed. The scrub and dust of the plains gradually gave way to rolling grasslands dotted with cattle hundreds, then thousands of them, all bearing the distinctive Circle H brand. Fences, sturdy and well-maintained, stretched for miles. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a kingdom, and he was its undisputed king. The sheer scale of it all was dizzying, further cementing her own insignificance. They finally crested a rise, and she saw the heart of the ranch laid out below. A large 2-story ranch house built of sturdy timber and stone stood proudly at the center, surrounded by a collection of barns, corrals, and bunkhouses that was bigger than the town of Prosperity itself. It was a hive of activity. Cowboys moved with purpose, their calls and whistles carrying on the wind. The air smelled of hay, livestock, and wood smoke. It was a world away from the silent, solemn halls of the convent. Cole didn't ride toward the impressive main house. Instead, he guided the horse toward a long, low building set off to the side, a large storehouse or barn. Its wide doors opened to the afternoon air. He reined in the horse and dismounted before reaching up to help her down. His hands went to her waist, strong and sure, and for a terrifying second, she felt as if she weighed nothing at all as he lifted her to the ground. She stumbled as her feet touched the earth, her legs unsteady. "This will do for now," he said, gesturing toward the storehouse. He untied her bundle and handed it to her. She followed him inside. The interior was vast and smelled of grain, leather, and dry wood. Shafts of dusty light slanted down from high windows, illuminating a cavernous space filled with sacks of feed, coils of rope, and farming equipment. In one corner, a small section had been partitioned off, creating a simple room. He led her to it. Inside was a narrow cot with a folded blanket, a small crate for a table, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. It was stark, clean, and utterly impersonal. It was the sort of space one might give to a transient field hand, not a guest. The well is out back. The cookhouse serves meals at sunup and sundown. Don't wander into the bunkhouse, and stay out of the main house, he instructed, his tone all business. Someone will come by in the morning to give you some work. He turned to leave, his duty done. Mr. Hartman," Elena said, her voice small in the cavernous barn. He paused at the door, his back to her. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate, hollow. She was grateful for the shelter, for being saved from the sun and the circling vultures in town, but gratitude was tangled with a deep, primal fear. She had been passed from one form of captivity to another. The convent had imprisoned her spirit. This place, this man, held her survival in his hands. He was her savior and her potential keeper, a contradiction that terrified her. He gave a slight, dismissive nod without turning around, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the immense, echoing silence. The last of the sunlight faded, and the barn grew dark. Elena didn't light the lantern he had left for her. She sat on the edge of the hard cot, clutching her bundle as if it were an anchor. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She was a disgraced woman, alone on a ranch full of rough men, utterly dependent on the mercy of a cold, powerful stranger. She replayed his every word, every gesture, searching for a clue to his intentions. He hadn't been cruel, but he hadn't been kind, either. He had been detached, as if he were managing a piece of livestock that had wandered onto his land. He had promised her shelter, a chance to work, but what did that mean? The men in town had offered her company. Was this just a more sophisticated version of the same transaction? Her mind, shaped by the sister's teachings, could only see a trap. She was a mouse, and he was a cat, and for now, he was simply choosing not to pounce. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She feared becoming his plaything, a temporary amusement to be used and discarded when he grew bored. Meanwhile, in the main house, Cole Hartman poured himself a measure of whiskey and stood on his porch, staring out into the velvet darkness, the familiar sounds of his ranch at night, the lowing of distant cattle, the soft nickering of horses, the faint strum of a guitar from the bunkhouse usually soothed him. Tonight, they did not. He was annoyed, profoundly and thoroughly annoyed with himself. What in the hell had he been thinking? Bringing a stray woman back to the ranch was the last thing he needed. It was an invitation for trouble. The men would talk. It would create complications. He took a long swallow of the fiery liquor, hoping it would burn away the unease. He told himself it was a practical decision. He'd told her the truth, a dead girl was a mess he didn't want, but he knew, in the honest quiet of his own mind, that it was more than that. It was the look in her eyes. He'd seen fear in women's eyes before, and he'd seen calculation, greed, and cunning. He had never seen what he saw in hers, a pure, unadulterated innocence paired with a core of steel. She hadn't pleaded or flirted or tried to manipulate him. She had faced him down, terrified but unbroken, and asked him what he wanted from her, ready to hear the worst. That quiet dignity had shaken something loose inside him, something he thought had rusted shut long ago. He was moved by her, by the raw injustice of her situation, and that terrified him more than any gunfight ever could. Emotions were a liability. Compassion was a weakness that other people exploited. He had built his empire by being hard, by being unreadable, by never letting anyone get close enough to see a vulnerability. And now this slip of a girl, with nothing to her name but a stolen reputation and a pair of stormy gray eyes, had slipped past his defenses without even trying. He felt a sudden, sharp, and entirely unwelcome protective instinct. He wanted to shield that defiant spark in her from a world that would do its best to snuff it out. He finished the whiskey in one gulp and set the glass down with a sharp click. No, he would not allow it. She was a problem to be managed, that's all. He would give her work, keep his distance, and in a week or a month, she would move on. He would treat her like any other hand. It was the only way. He was Cole Hartman, the master of the Circle H. He was in control. But as he looked across the yard toward the dark, silent storehouse, he had the unsettling feeling that for the first time in a very long time, he was not in control at all. The first light of dawn was a pale, gray wash that did little to warm the chill air of the high desert. Elena was awake long before it crept through the cracks in the storehouse walls. Sleep had been a fitful, shallow thing, punctuated by the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch and the haunting specter of her own uncertainty. But with the morning came a stark, cold resolve. She would not be a burden. She would not be a charity case. She would work until her hands bled and her back screamed, and she would build a new reputation for herself, one forged from sweat and diligence, not whispers and lies. She found the well, the cold water a shock to her skin that felt like a baptism, washing away the last vestiges of sleep and fear. When she made her way to the cookhouse, a long, low building already bustling with activity and smelling of coffee and frying bacon, the talk of the assembled cowboys died to a low murmur. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and the crude appraisal of men long without female company. Holding her chin high, she took a tin plate of food, ate quickly and silently in a corner, and was outside again before most had finished their first cup of coffee. Cole found her by the storehouse, already sweeping the packed earth in front of the wide doors with a makeshift broom. He stood for a moment, watching. She moved with a stiff, determined grace, her focus absolute. She was trying to make herself useful, to claim a patch of ground in a world that had offered her none. "There are better uses for your time, Miss Moore," he said, his voice making her jump. She turned, her face composed, her stormy eyes guarded. "I do not wish to be idle, sir." "You won't be?" He gestured with his head toward a massive barn, larger than the others, from which the sounds of horses could be heard. "The stables. Silas, the man who runs them, is getting old. His joints ache. He could use a strong back and a willing pair of hands. The work is hard, mucking out stalls, hauling water and feed. It is not work for a lady." The unspoken challenge hung in the air. He was testing her, expecting her to refuse, to complain. "I am not a lady, Mr. Hartman," she replied, her voice even. "I am a worker. I will do whatever is asked of me." His expression didn't change, but he gave a single, sharp nod. "Silas is expecting you." Silas was a man who looked as old and weathered as the leather of the saddles he mended. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes were a clear, kind blue. He looked Elena up and down, his gaze missing nothing, but there was no judgment in it. "The boss said you'd be coming," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Ever been around horses?" "No, sir," Elena admitted. "They're honest creatures." "More than you can say for most men," he grunted. "They know if you're scared, and they know if you're kind. You be kind to them. They'll be kind to you. Now, grab that pitchfork. The work don't do itself." The days that followed were a blur of unrelenting physical labor. The convent had prepared her for chores, but not for this. The pitchfork was heavy and awkward, the wheelbarrow of manure a monstrous weight. Her muscles screamed in protest, and angry red blisters bloomed on her soft palms, which soon broke, leaving them raw. She never complained. Every ache was a penance, every bead of sweat a purification. She was washing away the stain of prosperity, one stall at a time. At first, the horses, massive and intimidating, made her nervous, but as Silas taught her, she learned their language of nickers and snorts. She discovered that a gentle hand on a velvet nose could calm a skittish mare, and that speaking in a low, soft voice soothed them. They didn't know of Father Michael. They didn't care about whispers. They responded only to the truth of her touch, in the quiet solitude of the stables, surrounded by the warm, clean scent of hay and horse. Elena began to find a fragile peace. Cole watched her. He was discreet, never letting on that he was observing, but his icy eyes missed nothing. From the window of his office in the main house, he saw her wrestling with the heavy wheelbarrow, her slender frame straining with the effort. He saw her talking to the horses, her face softer and more open than he had ever seen it. He saw Silas showing her how to brush down his own prized bay stallion, and he saw the care with which she did it, her movements gentle and sure. He had known women who were decorative, women who were cunning, women who were desperate. He had never known a woman who worked like this, without a word of complaint, without a single artifice. There was a grit to her, a core of unyielding strength that lay hidden beneath her quiet demeanor. Each day, the image of the fragile, cast-out girl he'd brought from town faded a little more, replaced by this resilient, determined woman. The cynical part of him kept waiting for the facade to crack, for the request for an easier job, for a prettier dress, for some kind of payment beyond simple room and board. It never came. Her presence did not go unnoticed by the rest of the ranch. The cowboys, after their initial curiosity, mostly kept a respectful distance, an unspoken edict that came from the top down. But one man watched her with an open and festering resentment, Royce. Royce was the ranch foreman, a man in his 40s with a florid face, small, suspicious eyes, and a cruel set to his mouth. He had worked for Cole's father and considered himself the true heir to the ranch's management. He saw Cole's more modern, business-like approach as a personal affront. Royce ruled through fear and intimidation, and he saw Elena not as a person, but as a disruption to the established order and a potential threat to his own influence. The boss had never brought a woman to the ranch before, and Royce's sour, suspicious mind could only interpret her presence in one way. He found her one afternoon, refilling a water trough. "You're the little stray Hartman picked up," he said, his voice a greasy drawl. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. Elena straightened up, her hands tightening on the bucket. "My name is Elena Moore." "I don't care what your name is," Royce sneered. "I care about the work that gets done. Seems to me you're spending a lot of time whispering to the horses. The tack room's a mess. Leather needs cleaning and oiling. All of it. I want it done by sundown." It was an impossible task. The tack room was enormous, filled with dozens of saddles and bridles. It would take 2 men a full day. Silas, who had been nearby, stepped forward. "Now, Royce, her duties are here in the stalls. The boss said so himself." Royce's eyes narrowed. "I'm the foreman on this ranch. Old man, I say what the duties are. He turned his venomous gaze back to Elena. "Unless you've got other duties to attend to for the boss that keep you too busy." The insinuation was as vile as the tobacco stain in the dust. Elena's face went pale, but before she could speak, a cold voice cut through the air. "Her duties are what I assign her, Royce." Cole stood at the entrance to the stables, his expression like stone. He walked forward slowly, his spurs ringing with quiet menace on the hard-packed earth. He didn't look at Elena. His entire focus was on his foreman. "The tack room can wait," Cole said, his voice dangerously soft. "You, on the other hand, have paperwork you've been ignoring for a week. Get to it, now." Royce's face turned a mottled red. To be reprimanded so publicly, and over this girl, was a profound humiliation. He shot Elena a look of pure hatred before turning on his heel and stalking away. The silent promise of retribution hung in the air. A few weeks after her arrival, Cole needed supplies from Prosperity. It was a trip he usually had Royce or another hand make, but this time, he decided to go himself, as an afterthought, his face unreadable. He told Silas to have Elena accompany him. "She needs a change of clothes that are more suitable for work," was his clipped, practical explanation. The wagon ride into town was tense and silent. Elena sat on the hard bench beside him, acutely aware of the space between them. She dreaded returning to the town, to the whispers and the judgmental stares, as she feared. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. When Cole helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store, conversation on the boardwalk stopped. Windows suddenly required inspecting. Inside the store, the air grew thick with unspoken condemnation. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife and the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, watched Elena with eyes like hard little beads. As Elena looked at a bolt of sturdy denim, Mrs. Gable spoke to a friend, her voice carrying across the entire store. "It is remarkable," she declared, "how some people can fall into such fortunate circumstances. One day in the gutter, the next living under the protection of the wealthiest man in the territory. One does wonder what kind of talents are required for such a rapid advancement." The heat of 1,000 blushes rose in Elena's cheeks. The insult was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She wanted to run, to disappear, to simply cease to exist. But then she thought of the horses, of Silas's quiet approval, of the blisters on her hands that had finally turned to calluses. She had earned her place. She would not let them take that from her. She turned, met Mrs. Gable's malicious gaze directly, and held it for a silent, defiant moment before turning back to the fabric. She did not see the look on Cole's face. He stood by the counter, his transaction complete, and his eyes had gone from winter ice to killing frost. His gaze swept over Mrs. Gable and her cronies, and the sheer, cold fury in it made them flinch and fall silent. He said nothing. He didn't have to. He placed the denim on the counter, paid for it, and then walked to Elena's side. "Is there anything else you require, Miss Moore?" he asked, his voice perfectly level. Yet, in the context of the room, it was a thunderclap. It was a public declaration. She was with him. She was under his protection. "No, thank you," she managed to say. He guided her out of the store with a light, barely there touch on her elbow. Back in the wagon. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. It was filled with the aftershock of the confrontation. Elena stared at her hands, twisted in her lap, feeling the sting of humiliation all over again. He drove the wagon out of town and didn't stop until they were miles away. Pulling up under the shade of a lone, ancient cottonwood tree. "She had no right," Elena whispered, more to herself than to him. "No," Cole agreed, his voice a low growl. He was still angry, but the anger was a banked fire, tightly controlled. People like that feed on the weakness of others because they have none of their own strength. He turned to look at her, his gaze intense. "You were not weak in there. His unexpected praise was more startling than the insults had been.
I wanted to run.
But you didn't. That evening, a quiet rhythm had settled over the ranch. Elena had retreated to the stables, her sanctuary. She was grooming Cole's bay, Apollo, the rhythmic pull of the brush, a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. The horse was a magnificent animal, powerful and intelligent, and like his master, he was reserved, only offering his trust slowly.
He seems to like you.
Cole's voice came from the shadows. He was leaning against a stall door, watching her. She hadn't heard him approach.
He's a good horse,
she said softly, not stopping her work.
He's honest.
Cole walked closer, stopping a few feet away. The air in the barn was warm and thick with the scent of hay.
You have a way with them.
Silas says you're the best help he's ever had.
She shrugged, a small, self-conscious gesture. They don't ask for anything but kindness, and they don't tell lies.
He understood her meaning. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the soft swish of the brush against the horse's coat. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the gentle, non-judgmental presence of the animals, the walls between them seemed to thin. He wasn't the powerful ranch owner, and she wasn't the disgraced outcast. They were just two people who understood, in their own different ways, the profound loneliness of the world and the rarity of finding a creature you could trust. He looked at her, truly looked at her, her face, smudged with dust and framed by the soft halo of lantern light, held a quiet beauty that was more real and compelling than any he had ever seen. He saw the strength she tried to hide, the kindness she offered so freely to the animals, and the deep, unhealed wound of the injustice done to her. What the world called impurity, he was beginning to recognize as a rare and formidable purity of spirit. The fortress around his heart, so long under siege by cynicism, had just discovered a traitor within its walls, and for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to fight it. The seasons in the high desert of New Mexico turned with a violent, uncompromising suddenness. The long-baked stillness of summer did not fade gently into autumn. It was broken. One afternoon, the sky, which for months had been a vast, empty canvas of blue, began to curdle. A strange, yellowish light bathed the landscape, silencing the birds and making the cattle restless in the fields. The air grew heavy, thick, and unnervingly still. The old hands on the Circle H knew the signs. They squinted at the bruised purple clouds massing on the western horizon and began to move with a quiet urgency, securing ropes, checking latches, and herding the more vulnerable livestock into corrals closer to the main barns. It was a storm front, one of the ferocious ones that could tear across the plains, ripping up anything that wasn't tied down or deeply rooted. Elena felt the change in the atmosphere as a pressure against her skin. The horses in the stable grew skittish, their eyes rolling, their breath coming in nervous snorts. She moved among them, speaking in the low, calming tones they had come to trust, her presence a small island of peace in their rising sea of instinctual fear. Silas, his joints aching with the drop-in pressure, directed her with a grim face. "Check the south wall of the old barn. Girl, the timbers are old. Make sure the braces are holding." The old barn was a smaller, secondary structure used for mares about to foal and for storing excess hay. It was the first building Cole's father had erected on this land, and it showed its age. Elena ran her hands over the thick wooden braces, finding them solid, and latched the heavy door against the first mournful howl of the wind. By the time the sun should have been setting, the world was plunged into a premature twilight. The wind, no longer a whisper, had become a physical force, a battering ram that shrieked around the corners of the buildings. Then the rain came. It was not a cleansing shower, but a hard, horizontal deluge, thrown from the sky like handfuls of gravel. Lightning spiderwebbed across the heavens, followed instantly by cracks of thunder so loud they seemed to split the very air she breathed. Elena, Silas and a few other hands were huddled in the main stable, its newer, sturdier construction offering a sense of security. But Elena's thoughts kept drifting to the old barn, to the pregnant mares inside who would be terrified. She could feel their panic as if it were her own. Cole was a whirlwind of controlled energy, everywhere at once, dressed in a heavy oilskin slicker. He moved from the bunkhouse to the corrals, his voice a low, commanding bark that cut through the roar of the storm, directing his men, securing his empire against the elemental assault. His face was a mask of concentration, his entire being focused on the preservation of his assets, both animal and human. The storm reached its crescendo in a fury of sound and violence. There was a sudden, deafening crack, louder than the thunder, followed by a groaning, splintering roar. It was the sound of ancient timber giving way. "The old barn," a cowboy shouted. "The big cottonwood came down on it. The roof's gone in." Cole's head snapped around, his face grim in the flicker of a nearby lantern. "Is anyone inside?" "No, boss, we were all in here." But Elena's heart stopped. The mares, the foals, her charges, before anyone could react, before thought could catch up to impulse. She was moving. She wrenched open the stable door and ran out into the maelstrom. Elena Silas's old voice was ripped away by the wind. Cole saw the flash of her dark dress as she darted out into the blinding rain. "God damn it!" he roared, a mixture of fury and a sudden, sharp, unfamiliar stab of fear. "Get back here." But she was gone, a small, determined ghost swallowed by the storm. He started after her, but another cowboy grabbed his arm. "Boss, it ain't safe. The whole thing could come down." Cole shook him off, his eyes locked on the wreckage of the old barn. The massive cottonwood tree had crushed the center of the roof, and the south wall, the one she had checked just hours before, was leaning at a perilous angle. He could hear the terrified, high-pitched screaming of trapped horses from within. Elena scrambled over the fallen trunk, the rain plastering her hair to her face and soaking her thin dress in seconds, the cold seeping instantly into her bones. The inside of the barn was a chaotic nightmare. Broken timbers hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling. Panicked horses kicked and scrambled in the dark, their eyes wide with terror. One mare was trapped, her leg pinned beneath a heavy fallen beam. Another, a gentle palomino Elena had named Daisy, was backed into a corner, trembling violently, ready to bolt into a splintered wall. Ignoring the groan of the straining structure above her, Elena moved toward Daisy, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Easy, girl. Easy now. It's all right. I'm here." She reached out a hand, letting the mare catch her scent. The horse's terror was a palpable thing, a frantic energy that could kill them both. But Elena's calm was its own force of nature. She kept talking, her voice never wavering. And slowly, miraculously, the mare's trembling began to subside. From the shattered doorway, Cole watched, transfixed. He had run after her, his mind consumed with a cold rage at her recklessness. But what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. He saw this girl, this supposed pariah, this whisper-thin creature, walk into the heart of chaos and create a pocket of peace. He saw her lay a hand on the terrified mare's neck, and he saw the animal lean into her touch, finding an anchor in the storm. It was an act of such pure, selfless courage. It defied all logic. It wasn't about money or duty. It was about compassion, raw and unfiltered. "Two of you. Get that beam," he commanded the men who had followed him. He moved into the wreckage himself, his focus absolute. He saw what she was doing, and his mind instantly calculated the risks and the best course of action. Elena, once Daisy is clear. Get out. She didn't seem to hear him. She was focused on her task. As the men strained to lift the beam off the other mare's leg, Elena slowly, carefully, led Daisy toward the opening, step by painstaking step, her body shielding the horse from a swinging, broken rafter. just as they cleared the doorway. The rest of the south wall gave way with a final, explosive groan, collapsing inward in a cloud of dust and splintered wood. Elena was thrown forward by the force of the collapse, landing hard in the mud as the Palomino bolted into the relative safety of the rain-swept yard. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, the rain pouring down on her. Then she pushed herself up, her entire body shaking, not from fear, but from a bone-deep, ague-like chill. Cole was there in an instant. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and hauled her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with a complex storm of emotions, relief, anger, and something else he refused to name. She shook her head, unable to speak. Her teeth were chattering uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had fueled her was gone, leaving behind only the profound, penetrating cold. He looked at her, truly saw her. Her face was deathly pale, her lips tinged with blue. Her thin dress was plastered to her body, offering no protection at all. She was on the verge of collapsing. "You foolish, stubborn girl," he growled, but there was no heat in it. Without another word, he swept her up into his arms. She was shockingly light. He turned and strode not toward the storehouse, but toward the main house, his house, shouting orders over his shoulder. "Silas, get the horses settled, Royce. Assess the damage. Someone get a fire roaring in my study." He kicked the door to the main house open and carried her inside, leaving a trail of muddy water on the polished wooden floors. He didn't stop until he reached his study, a masculine room of leather and dark wood, where a fire was already beginning to crackle in the large stone hearth. He set her down in the large leather chair before the fire, where she sat, huddled and shivering, a small, drenched creature in the opulent room. "Get those wet clothes off," he ordered, his back to her as he poured a generous measure of brandy into a glass. Her mind was too numb with cold to even process the impropriety of his command. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, unable to work the simple buttons of her dress. She fumbled with them, her shivering growing more violent. Cole turned and saw her struggle. A curse escaped his lips. He strode over, and with a surprising gentleness, his large, calloused fingers moved to the buttons on her collar. He worked them loose with an impersonal efficiency. "You'll catch your death," he muttered, his focus entirely on the task. He pulled the wet dress away from her shoulders, leaving her in her thin, soaked chemise. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from a nearby chest and wrapped it tightly around her, cocooning her in its dry warmth. But it wasn't enough. Her shivering was deep and convulsive, shaking her entire frame. He could see that the chill had gone too deep, that the fire's warmth wasn't reaching her. He knew, with the practical knowledge of a man who'd seen cowboys nearly freeze to death in winter storms, that he had to get her warm, and fast. He pushed the chair closer to the hearth, knelt before her, and took her icy hands in his, rubbing them vigorously. Then, making a decision that defied every rule of distance he had ever set for himself, he pulled her out of the chair and sat in it himself, settling her in his lap and wrapping the blanket, and his own arms, around her. He held her against the solid heat of his own body, his chin resting on the top of her damp head. She was so fragile in his arms, her body trembling like a trapped bird. Her wet chemise was a cold, useless barrier between them. Without conscious thought, he reached under the blanket and untied the simple ribbon of her chemise, pushing the cold, damp fabric away from her back so that her skin was pressed directly against the warm wool of his shirt. The world contracted to the space of his arms, the roar of the fire, and the frantic beating of her own heart. This was it, the moment she had feared since her arrival. She was in his power, exposed and vulnerable, but there was no aggression in his touch, no crude demand in his embrace. There was only a steady, life-giving warmth. He was a human furnace, and he was lending her his fire, his strength, his very life. The violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor, For the first time since she was a small child, she felt completely, utterly safe. Cole held her, feeling the gradual return of warmth to her skin, the slowing of her frantic shivers. He looked down at her face, nestled against his chest. Her eyes were closed. Dark lashes fanned out against her pale cheeks. In this moment of utter vulnerability, she possessed a beauty so profound and pure, it stole his breath. He saw not the disgraced woman from town, not the diligent stable hand, but the essence of her, a soul of fierce, untamed goodness. He saw in her the compassion he lacked, the selflessness he'd never known. She was everything he was not, and he wanted, with a sudden, desperate ferocity, to protect her from a world that would never understand her worth. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, her gray eyes dark and deep in the firelight, filled with a dawning awareness, confusion, and a fragile, hesitant trust. Her lips, no longer blue, were soft and parted slightly. The urge was overwhelming. He wanted to kiss her, to taste the rain on her lips, to claim this extraordinary woman as his own. But he stopped himself. He saw the flicker of fear that still lingered in the depths of her eyes, the shadow of past hurts. To take a kiss now would be to abuse the trust she was so tentatively offering. It would make him no better than the men in town. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice a low, rough whisper against her hair, a vow spoken more to himself than to her. Every kiss, he promised, the words torn from a place in his heart he didn't know existed. Every single one, from this day on, will be yours, to give or to keep. I will never take one from you. Tears welled in Elena's eyes and slipped down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. They were not tears of fear or sadness, but of a profound, shattering release. He was offering her not passion, but power. He was returning to her the one thing that had been stolen, the ownership of her own self. Outside, pressed against the rain-streaked window of the study, a figure watched. Royce, his face a mask of incandescent fury, saw it all. He didn't hear the softly spoken words. He didn't see the tenderness or the vow. He saw his boss, the cold, untouchable Cole Hartman, cradling the half-clothed girl in his arms before the fire. He saw it not as an act of salvation, but of ultimate conquest. The stray had not just found shelter. She had taken the throne, and in the black, venomous heart of the foreman, a plan began to form, a plan to tear her down, and to destroy the man who had lifted her up. The dawn that followed the storm was pristine and deceptively peaceful. The air, washed clean by the rain, was crisp and smelled of wet earth and sage. A fragile new world seemed to have been born from the chaos of the night, and in the quiet of Cole's study, where Elena had finally fallen into a deep, healing sleep in the big leather chair, a fragile new understanding had been born as well. She awoke to the gentle touch of a woman's hand on her shoulder. An older, kind-faced woman with flour on her apron and eyes as warm as her smile was looking down at her. "Mr. Hartman said to let you sleep, dear," the woman said softly. "But the sun is high now. My name is Martha. I keep house for him. I've drawn you a hot bath and laid out some fresh clothes." Elena's cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. She was still wrapped in the wool blanket, her own damp things in a heap on the floor. The memory of the night came rushing back, the cold, the fear, and then the astonishing, profound safety of Cole's arms. His promise echoed in her mind, a quiet, revolutionary music. Every kiss will be yours. Martha led her from the study, through the imposing main house, and up a wide staircase to a modest but comfortable guest room. It was a world away from her cot in the storehouse. It had a real bed with a quilt, a window that looked out over the sprawling grasslands, and the promised bath was steaming in a copper tub. It was a gesture of such profound respect and care that it brought tears to Elena's eyes. For the first time, She allowed a dangerous, delicate seed of hope to take root in the ravaged soil of her heart. Perhaps this was a place she could belong. Perhaps Cole Hartman was a man she could trust. But while a fragile peace settled over the Circle H in prosperity, the storm's aftermath was giving rise to a far more destructive tempest. Royce rode into town that afternoon, his face a mask of false concern. He made his way to Gable's General Store, the town's undisputed hub of gossip, and leaned against the counter. "Accepting the cup of coffee, Mrs." Gable offered him. "Terrible storm last night." "Royce, mister," Gable said, weighing out a sack of beans. Royce sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of a burdened man. "That it was. Henry, that it was. We lost the old barn, but it's not the timber I'm worried about." Mrs. Gable, her ears sharp, moved closer. "Is everything all right with Mr. Hartman?" "The boss is a strong man," Royce said, staring into his coffee cup as if it held a tragic secret. "But he has a good heart, a soft spot, you might say, and I fear it's being taken advantage of." He shook his head slowly. "That girl he brought in, the one from the convent, she's a clever one, knows how to play the part of a frightened doe, but I'd wager she's got the cunning of a fox." He took a sip of coffee, letting his words hang in the air. "I saw them. After the worst of it," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "in his private study. Fire roaring, him holding her, close, very close. She was wearing next to nothing." He looked up, his small eyes feigning a man's worldly resignation. Of course, a man like the boss, alone in that big house. He has needs, and she's there to provide them. A very comfortable arrangement for a girl with nothing to her name. She'll have the Hartman brand on her before Christmas. Mark my words, not on a contract, if you take my meaning. The poison was delivered. It spread through the store, and then the town, with the speed and intensity of a prairie fire. Royce's carefully crafted narrative confirmed every dark suspicion the townsfolk held. They saw the image he painted the virtuous, wealthy rancher being ensnared by the wiles of a fallen woman, a seductress using her body to claw her way to a fortune. Elena was no longer just an outcast. She was a predator, a threat to the natural order of things. The whispers did not take long to travel back to the Circle H. A young ranch hand, sent to town for supplies, returned with more than just sacks of flour. Elena was walking from the stables, the satisfying ache of a day's work in her muscles, when she overheard him talking to another cowboy behind the blacksmith's shop. "Royce says he's seen him. Says she's got her hooks in the boss so deep he can't see straight," the young hand said, his voice full of crude excitement. "Traded that little cot in the barn for his bed, if you get my drift. Smartest whore in the territory. I'll give her that." The words struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, and the world tilted on its axis. Every kindness Cole had shown her, every moment of dawning trust, was instantly twisted into something sordid and ugly. The rescue from the storm, the warmth of his arms, the impossible tenderness of his promise in the town's eyes, and now in the eyes of the men she worked alongside. It was all a vulgar transaction. She hadn't been saved, she had been purchased. The shame was a suffocating cloak. She fled to the solitude of her new room, but the comfort it offered was now a source of agony. The soft bed, the clean clothes, the view from the window. They were not gifts of kindness, but the wages of sin. She saw herself as they saw her, a parasite, a stain on the reputation of a good man. The brand Father Michael had put on her was not just a lie whispered in a convent. It was an undeniable truth that followed her everywhere, poisoning everything she touched. The social pressure on Cole began to mount in its own insidious way. It came not as a direct confrontation, but in the subtle shifts of tone and attitude from the men he did business with. Mr. Sterling, the president of the bank in Santa Fe, made a special trip out to the ranch, ostensibly to discuss a land purchase. After the business was concluded, he cleared his throat. his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Cole," he began, his tone oozing false concern. "You and I go back a long way. Your father was a pillar of this territory. A man's reputation, his good name, is the foundation of everything. There is talk, a certain young woman you've taken in. In business, perception can be as important as reality. Investors value stability, predictability." Cole's face, which had been cordial, turned to granite. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, his back to the banker. "Are you questioning the stability of my accounts?" "Sterling." "Of course not. Your finances are impeccable." "Then I suggest you concern yourself with them," Cole said, his voice lethally cold. "How I manage my household and who I choose to offer my protection to is my business. Not yours, not the town's, not the bank's." The dismissal was absolute. The banker left in a flustered hurry, but the encounter left a bitter taste in Cole's mouth. He was not a man to be influenced by gossip, but he was not a fool. He understood the power of a lie, how it could undermine the foundations of trust he had spent years building. The town was trying to fence him in, to force his hand. A cold fury settled in his gut. Elena saw the banker leave, saw the rigid set of Cole's shoulders as he stood staring out the window long after the buggy had disappeared. In that moment, her own misery was eclipsed by a terrible, clarifying guilt. She was the source of this trouble. Her presence, the very fact of her existence on his land, was a liability. She had brought the ugliness of prosperity to his doorstep, and it was threatening to tarnish his name, his business, his entire world. He had saved her from the storm, only for her to become the storm that now threatened to wreck him. The decision, when it came, was both the hardest and the easiest she had ever made. Her desire to protect him from the consequences of his own kindness was a force more powerful than her own fear of the wilderness. She could not repay his goodness by being the instrument of his ruin. That night, she sat at the small writing desk in her room, a single candle pushing back the darkness. The pen felt heavy in her hand. What could she say? How could she explain that she was leaving not because he had been unkind, but because he had been too kind? She wrote and rewrote the words, the paper stained with more than one tear, until only the simple, painful truth remained. She folded the note, took none of the clothes Martha had laid out for her, and dressed again in her own plain, worn dress before the first hint of dawn, while the ranch was still wrapped in a deep and silent slumber. She slipped out of the main house. She didn't look back. She couldn't bear to. She just walked, a solitary figure moving away from the only place she had ever felt safe, heading back into the wilderness that had almost claimed her once before. Cole awoke feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The encounter with Sterling had solidified his resolve. Let the town talk. Let them whisper and scheme. He would not be governed by their petty, hypocritical rules. Today, he would speak to Elena. He would tell her that she belonged here, that the Circle H was her home, and that he would stand against the entire world for her. His promise in the night had been an instinct. Today he would make it a foundation. He went to her room and knocked softly. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, a flicker of unease stirring within him. Pushing the door open, he found the room empty. The bed was perfectly made, the room neat and still. It was as if she had never been there at all. Then he saw it, a single folded piece of paper on the center of the pillow. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He picked it up, his hands suddenly unsteady, and unfolded it. Her handwriting was clear, precise, the script of a convent girl. Mr. Hartman, you saved my life, and I have repaid you by bringing ruin to your name. I listened to the whispers, and I heard what they are saying about you, and about me. I see now that they were right about one thing. I am a source of trouble. A good man like you should not be destroyed by a woman like me. Thank you for the warmth and the kindness,
I will never forget it. Please, do not look for me. This is the only way I can repay your goodness.
Elena Moore. The paper crinkled in his tightening fist. The words were a knife in his gut, twisting with every beat of his heart. She was gone. She had run away. Not from him, but for him. She had walked back into the hell of loneliness and fear to protect his reputation. The sheer, selfless nobility of it shattered the last of his cynical defenses. In that moment, everything became terrifyingly clear. The annoyance he'd felt at getting involved, the grudging admiration, the fierce, protective instinct, they were all just lesser names for a truth he had been too guarded and too cynical to admit to himself. It was not just about protection. It was not about honor. It was not about defiance against the town. It was about her, Elena. The thought of her, alone and believing she was a curse, was more than he could bear. His business, his reputation, the opinions of fools like Sterling and Royce, they were all just dust. She was the solid ground. He realized, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could lose his entire empire and it would mean nothing if he lost her. His life, which he had thought so complete, was utterly and irrevocably empty without her in it. The fortress he had built around his heart had not just been breached, it had been razed to the ground, and on its ruins stood this one undeniable truth. He loved her. He could not let her go. He would not. He strode out of the room, the crumpled letter still clutched in his hand, his face a mask of granite resolve. He was no longer a man reacting to events. He was a man with a singular, all-consuming purpose. He would find her, and when he did, he would not be offering her shelter. He would be offering her everything. Elena walked with no destination. The sun, which had been her enemy on the day she left prosperity, was now a remote, indifferent god in a pale sky. Her world had shrunk to the rhythmic crunch of her shoes on the gravelly soil and the burning ache in her legs. She followed a dry wash, its winding path leading her steadily upward, away from the flat plains and into the broken, rocky foothills of the mountains. This was a land that did not want her, a place of thorny scrub, watchful lizards, and a silence so profound it felt like a judgment. She was not running from Cole. She was running for him. The distinction was a shard of glass in her heart. Every act of kindness he had shown her had, in her mind, become another link in the chain that would drag him down. The town's venom had worked its way into her soul, and she now believed its central, damning lie she was a contagion, and the only cure was to isolate herself forever. Her focus was so turned inward on her own guilt and misery that she didn't hear the horses until they were nearly upon her. The sound of hoofbeats on rock, jarringly close, made her spin around, her heart seizing in her chest. For one wild, hopeful second, she thought it was Cole, but the men who crested the rise were not him. It was Royce, his florid face split in a triumphant, predatory grin. Flanking him were two of the same louts who had accosted her in town that first day, their faces a mixture of cheap bravado and nervous excitement. "Well, look what we have here," Royce drawled. Reining in his horse, the other two fanned out, their movements practiced, cutting off any chance of escape. The little canary has flown her golden cage. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over Elena, momentarily paralyzing her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a dry whisper. "What do I want?" Royce chuckled. "A low, ugly sound. I want to prove a point. You see, the boss, he thinks you're something special, thinks you're some kind of saint in a stable girl's dress. But I know what you are, and I think it's time everyone else knew, too." He dismounted, his boots landing heavily. "We're just going to take a little ride. You and I, show you some real mountain hospitality. You're going to learn what happens to little tramps who get above their station." One of the other men, emboldened by Royce's confidence, grabbed her arm. His touch was rough, possessive, and it shattered Elena's paralysis. A lifetime of fear and repression, of being judged and condemned, ignited into a single, white-hot point of fury. She twisted, her free hand lashing out, her nails raking across his face. The man howled in pain and surprise, stumbling back with bloody scratches on his cheek. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Royce's grin vanished, replaced by a mask of cold rage. "So the little kitten has claws," he snarled. He strode forward and backhanded her across the face. The blow was brutal, snapping her head to the side and sending a shower of stars across her vision. The taste of blood filled her mouth. Before she could recover, they had her, hauling her struggling form and throwing her sideways across Royce's saddle like a sack of grain. One of them tied her wrists with a rough piece of rope as Royce swung up behind her. "You'll pay for that, girl," he hissed in her ear. "His breath foul. I promise you that." And he spurred his horse, leading his two cronies deeper into the unforgiving labyrinth of the mountains. Cole's rage was a cold, silent, and exquisitely focused thing. He stood in her empty room, the crumpled note a testament to her selfless, heartbreaking folly. He did not shout. He did not break things. His fury was too deep, too vast for such useless displays. It settled into the core of his being, honing his senses and clarifying his purpose. He went first to the stables, his long strides eating up the ground. Silas was there, his old face etched with a worry that mirrored Cole's own. "She's gone, ain't she?" the old man rasped. "Did you see Royce this morning?" Cole's question was sharp, direct. He rode out an hour after sunup. Took those two new hands with him, the shiftless ones, Miller and Cobb. Said he was going to check the north fence line. The north fence line was in the opposite direction of the mountains. A lie. The pieces clicked into place with sickening certainty. Royce's jealousy, the town's gossip. Her disappearance, it was all one venomous serpent. "Saddle Apollo," Cole commanded, "and get me Jebediah and young Billy. Tell them to bring rifles and fill their canteens. And Silas, if you see Royce before I do, shoot him." The old man nodded, his jaw tight. He understood. Cole was a master of his domain. He knew every rock, every wash, every trail on the thousands of acres that made up the Circle H. He found her tracks easily, the small, solitary footprints leading away from the ranch. He followed them at a steady canter, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the story written in the dust. He saw the point where she had stopped, where the earth was scuffed, and he saw the other tracks, the 3 sets of shod hoofprints that intercepted hers. There was a dark, damp spot in the dirt, blood. The cold rage in his gut turned to ice. He spurred Apollo forward, the powerful stallion leaping into a gallop. Jebediah and Billy, 2 of his most loyal and steady hands, flanked him, their faces grim, their rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They rode hard, the rhythmic thunder of their hooves a drumbeat of impending violence, following the trail that climbed relentlessly into the high country. The place Royce had chosen was a box canyon, a natural dead end with sheer rock walls on 3 sides. It was isolated, defensible, and utterly inescapable. They had dragged Elena from the horse and shoved her toward a small campfire they had built. Her cheek was swollen and bruised, her lip was split, but her eyes held a defiant, unbroken fire. She had refused to cry, refused to plead, and her silence was infuriating Royce more than any scream could. "Not so high and mighty now. Are you?" he taunted, pacing before her. Miller and Cobb stood behind him, their initial excitement having curdled into a sullen, nervous apprehension. This had gone further than they'd expected. "You thought you had him, didn't you? The big boss thought you'd be the lady of the manor, but you're nothing. You're just a piece of trash the church threw out. And after we're done, Hartman won't even want the scraps." He was talking to her, but his real audience was the absent Cole. Every insult to her was an arrow aimed at his boss's pride. He wanted to break her, to sully her so completely that she would become a walking symbol of Cole's foolishness. He will come for you, Elena said, her voice low and steady, though her heart was pounding against her ribs. Royce laughed. Let him come. I want him to. I want him to see what he threw away his reputation for. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. But by the time he gets here, there won't be anything left worth saving. He reached for her. A single gunshot cracked through the canyon, the sound impossibly loud as it echoed off the rock walls. The hat was plucked from Royce's head as if by an invisible hand. He froze, his hand hovering in midair, his face a mask of disbelief. Take one more step, and the next one goes through your skull. Cole's voice came from the rocks above the canyon entrance, cold and clear as a tombstone. He stood there, silhouetted against the sky, a rifle in his hands. Jebediah and Billy were positioned on either side of him, forming a perfect triangle of death. Royce and his men scrambled for cover, yanking their pistols from their holsters. The canyon, which had been a trap for Elena, now became a killing box for them. You're a fool, Hartman Royce screamed, firing wildly up at the rocks. She's not worth it. Drop your guns and you might live to see another sunrise, Cole yelled back, his voice cutting through the explosions of gunfire. But Royce was consumed by his hatred. There was no turning back. The canyon erupted into a cacophony of war. Bullets whined and ricocheted, chipping away at the stone. Cole and his men were superior marksmen, their fire deliberate and deadly. Miller was the first to fall, clutching his shoulder and screaming as his pistol clattered to the ground. Cole used the covering fire from his men to move, sliding down a steep scree slope with breathtaking speed, landing lightly on the canyon floor. He wanted to close the distance. He needed to get to Elena. He moved from boulder to boulder, his Colt now in his hand, a fluid and lethal shadow. Elena, huddled behind the meager cover of a scrubby juniper bush, watched the battle with a terrifying clarity. The world had slowed down. She saw Cole, moving with a grace and purpose that was both beautiful and horrifying. He was a force of nature, a righteous storm of violence unleashed on her behalf. Cobb, seeing Cole advancing, broke cover and charged, firing his pistol wildly. Cole's own gun bucked once, and Cobb crumpled to the ground, his charge ending in a heap of dust and stillness. Now it was just Royce. The foreman was pinned down behind a large rock outcropping near where Elena was hiding. He was desperate. He risked a look over the rock, firing a shot at Cole. Cole returned fire, diving for new cover. As he landed, he cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain. He slumped against the boulder, his left arm hanging limp and useless, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his sleeve. Elena's world shattered. Seeing him hit, seeing him vulnerable, did something to her. The fear, the convent-bred horror of violence, the lifetime of being a victim, it was all burned away in a single, roaring inferno of protective rage. He had been hurt for her. He was bleeding for her. Royce saw it too. He saw his chance, with Cole wounded and pinned down. He rose from his cover, his pistol leveled, a triumphant sneer on his face. It's over. Hartman. He was going to kill Cole. Elena didn't think. She acted. Cobb's fallen pistol lay in the dust only a few feet from her. She scrambled for it, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel and wood. She had never held a gun in her life. It was an object of sin, a tool of death. But in that moment, it was a tool of salvation. She rose to her knees, bringing the heavy weapon up with both hands, just as Silas had once shown a young Billy how to do in the yard. She saw Royce, his back to her, taking careful aim at the man who had promised her every kiss. Time stopped. She saw the sneer on Royce's face. She saw Cole, trying to bring his own gun to bear with one hand, his face pale and contorted in pain. She smelled the gunpowder in the air. She felt the rough checkering of the pistol grip in her hand. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil a brutal shock that slammed her back on her heels. The gun flew from her numb fingers. Royce jerked as if struck by lightning. He staggered, a look of utter astonishment on his face. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding hers. He couldn't comprehend it. The little canary, the mouse! He opened his mouth, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed, his face hitting the hard-packed earth of the canyon floor. Silence descended, absolute and profound. It was broken only by the whisper of the wind and the ragged sound of Cole's breathing. Jebediah and Billy scrambled down from the rocks, their rifles ready, securing the scene. But Elena only had eyes for Cole. She ran to him, stumbling to her knees by his side. He was pale, leaning heavily against the rock, but he was alive. His eyes, full of pain, found hers. He looked from her terrified face to the fallen form of Royce, and then to the pistol lying in the dust between them. He understood. She had saved him. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing the tear track on her dusty, bruised cheek. There were no words. There was no need for them. In the heart of that bloody, violent canyon, surrounded by the wreckage of Royce's hatred, they looked at each other, and the promise he had made in the firelight was finally, irrevocably sealed in the crucible of gunpowder and blood. The silence that descended upon the canyon was heavier and more terrifying than the gunfire had been. It was a silence filled with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder, the sight of still forms in the dust, and the ragged, painful sound of Cole's breathing. Elena knelt beside him, the world outside the small circle of his pain having ceased to exist. Jebediah and Billy were efficient and grim, their movements economical as they secured the scene. It was Jeb who gently took the fallen pistol from where it lay near Elena's hand, his touch on her shoulder a brief, respectful acknowledgement of what she had done. But her focus was solely on Cole. His face was chalk white beneath its tan, and a line of pain was etched deeply beside his mouth. Yet, when his eyes met hers, they were filled not with agony, but with a fierce, burning clarity. "Elena," he rasped, his good hand finding hers, his grip surprisingly strong. The name on his lips was not a question or a command, but a statement, an anchor. The journey back to the Circle H was a slow, agonizing procession. Jebediah, with a grim knowledge of battlefield medicine, had tightly bound Cole's arm to stop the bleeding, but every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of pain through him. They had insisted he ride the gentlest pack horse, but Cole had refused. With Billy's help, he mounted his own stallion, Apollo, and then reached down his good hand for Elena. "Get up," he commanded, his voice strained but absolute. "You ride with me." There was no argument. She was lifted up to sit in front of him, her back against his chest, her hands resting on the saddle horn. It was a mirror of their first ride together, but everything had changed. Then, she had been a terrified refugee, caged in his powerful arms. Now, she was his shield, her body supporting his, her hands ready to steady him if he faltered. He leaned his weight against her. A silent admission of his own vulnerability and a profound, unspoken statement of his trust. She was no longer his ward. She was his partner in the grim aftermath of survival. Their arrival at the ranch sent a shockwave through the assembled hands. They saw their formidable boss, the unshakable Cole Hartman, slumped in the saddle, his arm bloody and bound. They saw the bruises on Elena's face, the split lip, the haunted, weary look in her eyes, and they saw the way he depended on her, the way his good arm was wrapped around her waist, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him upright. The last vestiges of Royce's poisonous whispers evaporated in the harsh light of that reality. This was not the tableau of a seductress and her fool. This was the portrait of two warriors returning from battle. Martha met them on the porch, her usual warmth replaced by a steely competence. "Bring him in," she ordered, her eyes quickly assessing the damage. "Billy, ride for Dr. Miller in Santa Fe. Tell him it's urgent. Jeb, get me the whiskey and a pot of boiling water." They helped Cole into the house and to his own large bedroom on the ground floor. He gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing to release his hold on Elena until he was safely on the edge of the bed. "See to her," he commanded Martha, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Martha's gentle but firm hands guided a numb Elena to a chair. The old housekeeper cleaned the cut on her lip and the scrapes on her face with a tenderness that nearly broke the dam of Elena's tightly controlled emotions. She had been so focused on Cole, on the violence, that she hadn't registered her own injuries. As Martha worked, Elena's body began to tremble, the delayed shock of the day's events finally taking hold. She looked down at her hands and could still feel the phantom weight of the gun, could still hear the deafening roar as she pulled the trigger. She had taken a life. The convent girl in her recoiled in horror, but the woman who had knelt by Cole's side knew, with a terrible certainty, that she would do it again to save him. The doctor arrived hours later, a grizzled, no-nonsense man who had seen more than his share of gunshot wounds. He extracted the bullet from Cole's upper arm, cleaned and stitched the wound, and left him pale and weak, but on the mend. Throughout the entire ordeal, Cole had refused to let Elena leave the room. She sat in a chair by his bedside, a silent, watchful guardian. The vast space of the ranch house, which had once felt so intimidating, had shrunk to the quiet intimacy of this sick room. The distance between them, once measured in miles of social standing and emotional walls, had vanished completely. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Elena became the mistress of his recovery. She worked alongside Martha, learning to change his bandages, to spoon broth between his lips when the fever was high, to read to him from the books in his study when the pain kept him from sleeping. The physical act of caring for him was a balm to her own wounded spirit. It was a tangible way to counteract the violence she had committed, a way to nurture the life she had fought to protect. He, in turn, watched her. He saw the quiet efficiency with which she moved, the gentle confidence she assumed. She was no longer afraid to speak to the ranch hands who came to the door for orders, relaying his instructions with a calm authority that commanded their respect. He saw the shadows of the canyon slowly recede from her eyes, replaced by a deep, steady light. One evening, as she was replacing the bandage on his arm, her touch deft and gentle, he spoke, his voice quiet but strong. "You saved my life, Elena." She paused, her eyes fixed on her work. "You were hurt because of me." "No," he said, his good hand covering hers, stilling her movements. "I was hurt protecting what is mine." He let the words settle in the quiet room. "And you, Elena Moore, are mine." It was not a statement of ownership, but a declaration of belonging, a statement of fact as solid and real as the land outside the window. When he was strong enough to sit a horse, though his arm was still in a sling, he knew what he had to do. The poison had been seeded in prosperity, and the antidote had to be administered in the same place. "I'm riding into town," he told her as she stood on the porch, watching him prepare Apollo. "I want you to ride with me." A flicker of the old fear returned to her eyes. The whispers, the stares, the humiliation. He saw it and stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "No more running," he said softly. "Not for you, not for me. We face them together." She looked at him, at the unyielding strength in his eyes, and found her own reflected there. She gave a single, firm nod. They rode into prosperity side by side, not as a rancher and his ward, but as equals. His wounded arm was a stark symbol of the violence that had transpired, and her bruised but dignified face was a testament to her survival. They did not stop at the edge of town. They rode directly to the center, reining in their horses before the wide porch of Gable's General Store. It was the middle of the day, and the street was busy. As before, their presence caused all activity to cease. Doors opened, and people emerged from the saloon. The blacksmiths and the mercantile. They gathered in a silent, curious circle, Mrs. Gable appeared on the porch of her store, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour righteousness. The banker, Sterling, watched from the window of his office. Even Father Michael, drawn by the commotion, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face impassive. Cole let the silence stretch, his cold, assessing gaze sweeping over them all, making each person feel individually judged. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with absolute authority to every corner of the street. "There has been trouble on my land," he began, his voice flat and hard as iron. "A foreman who forgot his place, men who followed him in his foolishness. The trouble has been dealt with. It is over." He paused, letting them absorb the chilling finality of his words. Then he turned his gaze directly to Mrs. Gable. "But the trouble started here," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, yet losing none of its intensity. "It started with whispers, with lies, with the bitter, petty judgments of small-minded people." His eyes moved over the crowd, a silent accusation that left none of them untouched. "You took a good, honorable woman and tried to tear her down with your venom. Your lies nearly got her killed." He reached over and took Elena's hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a public and undeniable gesture of unity. "So let me be clear, so that no one in this town ever misunderstands me again." He raised their joined hands slightly, a banner of his intent. "This is Elena Moore. She is the woman I have chosen. Her honor is my honor. Her good name is now my name. If you speak a word against her, you speak it against me. If you touch her, you answer to me." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a deadly, personal whisper that every person present felt was aimed directly at them. "There will be no more talk." For a long moment, the town was utterly silent, held captive by the sheer force of his will. He had not just defended her, he had bound her to himself, surrounding her with the impenetrable fortress of his name, his wealth, and his fearsome reputation. Mrs. Gable's face was pale with fury and impotence. Father Michael stared at the ground. A few of the townsfolk, seeing the quiet strength in Elena's face and the unwavering devotion in Cole's, felt a prick of shame. Others simply felt fear. The social war was over. Cole Hartman had won. Without another word, he turned Apollo's head, and they rode out of town, leaving the stunned and silent populace in their wake. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable, settled silence. The air felt lighter, the sun warmer. Later that evening, Elena stood on the wide porch of the main house, looking out as the setting sun painted the mountains in hues of rose and gold. It was the same vast, intimidating landscape she had first seen weeks ago, but it no longer felt alien. It felt like a promise. It felt like home. Cole came to stand behind her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, his lips brushing against her hair. She thought back to the girl who had stood in the dust of prosperity, alone and shivering with fear and shame. She remembered the trembling that had racked her body in the storehouse, the cold terror in the canyon. She took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the solid warmth of Cole against her back, the steady beat of his heart. The shivering was gone. The cold had finally, truly left her. She was not the same person. The fires of suffering, injustice, and finally, love had burned away the frightened girl and forged a woman in her place. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice clear and steady as she turned in his embrace to face him. "I'm not cold anymore." A month passed, then two. The fierce heat of summer mellowed into the golden clarity of autumn. The grasslands of the Circle H turned the color of honey, and the air at dawn and dusk grew a crystalline edge. Life on the ranch settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. The gaping wound left by Royce's betrayal and the subsequent violence was healing. knitting together into a scar that was a part of the ranch's story, a part of its strength. Elena no longer slept in the guest room, by a quiet, mutual consent that needed no formal discussion. Her few belongings had found their way into the master bedroom, into the room that was Cole's. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, the large, masculine spaces softening with her presence. There were wild flowers in a vase on the dining table. The scent of fresh bread often mingled with the smell of leather and wood smoke, and the sound of her low, gentle humming could sometimes be heard from the kitchen where she helped Martha. She was not the lady of the manor in the way Royce had sneeringly predicted. She did not wear silks or give orders. She was simply Elena. She still spent most of her mornings in the stables with Silas, her hands gentle and sure on the horses she loved. But now, when she finished her work, she did not retreat to a lonely cot. She walked to the main house, her house, and her presence there was as natural and essential as the fire in the hearth. The Cowboys, who had once seen her as a curiosity or a temptation, now treated her with a deep and unwavering respect. She was the woman who had saved the boss's life. She was the woman who had faced down a gunman. But more than that, they saw the profound change in Cole Hartman himself. The hard, cynical shell he had worn for years had been cracked open, and the man underneath was stronger, steadier, and more complete than he had ever been. One morning, Elena rose just before the dawn, drawn from the warmth of the bed by the pull of the coming day. Cole was still asleep, his breathing deep and even, his face in repose looking younger. The harsh lines of command and weariness softened. His wounded arm, now fully healed, was draped across the pillow where her head had been. She stood for a moment, looking at him, a wave of love so fierce and protective washing over her that it almost took her breath away. He was her safe harbor, her fierce protector, but she knew, with a certainty that had become the bedrock of her new life, that she was his as well. She slipped on a simple dress and went out onto the wide front porch. A warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. The sky to the east was a pale, pearlescent gray, just beginning to blush with the faintest hint of rose. The great, silent expanse of the plains spread out before her, no longer a terrifying void, but a canvas of possibility. She breathed in the cool, clean air, the scent of the earth and the distant cattle. This porch was where she had first stood as a rescued woman, trembling and uncertain. Now, she stood on it as its mistress, not by title or decree, but by the simple, undeniable fact of belonging. She thought of the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the girl cowering in the dust of prosperity, branded by a lie she had no power to fight. She thought of the cold fear in the storehouse, the back-breaking labor in the stables that had been her salvation, the terror of the storm, and the consuming, clarifying fire of the canyon. She was no longer that girl. The shame had been burned away. The fear had been faced and conquered. The need for society's approval, a need that had been bred into her by the stern sisters of the convent, had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of her own worth. Her honor was not something that could be bestowed by a priest or stolen by a gossip. It was a thing she had forged herself, in the crucible of hardship, with courage and resilience, and finally, with the terrifying, liberating act of pulling a trigger to defend a life that had become more precious to her than her own. A pair of strong arms circled her waist from behind, and she leaned back into the familiar, solid warmth of Cole's chest without surprise. He had a way of moving, for such a large man, with a quietness that was a part of the landscape itself. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was now cresting the edge of the world, spilling liquid gold across the land. "You're up early," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I like to watch the day begin," she said softly. "It feels new, every time." "Everything feels new with you here," he said, and the simple, honest truth of his words was more potent than any flowery poetry. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching as the light chased the last of the shadows from the plains. The ranch below them was stirring to life. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the cheerful shouts of the cowboys heading out for the day's work. It was the music of their life, the soundtrack of their shared world. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked unexpectedly. "The quiet, the order of the life you had before?" She knew he meant the convent. She considered the question, searching for the truth within herself. She remembered the cool stone, the scent of beeswax, the predictable, unchanging rhythm of the bells that had marked out every hour of her existence. It had been a life without want, but it had also been a life without choice, a life without color, a life without love. "I was safe there," she admitted, her voice thoughtful. "But I was not free. I didn't know what freedom was until I thought I had lost everything." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She looked into his eyes, the color of a winter sky, and saw in their depths the fierce love and unwavering respect that had been her ultimate liberation. "You gave me that, Cole. You gave me a place where I could be myself, not who someone else told me I had to be." He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the intelligence in her stormy gray eyes, the gentle curve of her lips that he had, by some miracle, earned the right to kiss. The memory of his promise, spoken in the dark intimacy of the fire-lit study, rose between them, a sacred unspoken vow. He had offered her a choice, and in doing so, had won her heart completely. He lowered his head, his lips hovering a breath from hers. His voice was a rough, tender whisper, filled with an emotion that still felt new and astonishing to him. "Every kiss will be yours," he said, his eyes holding hers, his soul bared in that simple, repeated promise, "till the day I die." This time the tears that welled in her eyes were not of relief or release, but of pure, unadulterated joy. This time there was no fear, no hesitation. This time she was the one who closed the small distance between them. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was not taken, but freely, joyously given. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of deep, settled love. It spoke of shared sunrises and quiet evenings, of storms weathered and battles won. It was a kiss of homecoming, a sealing of their bond, a silent promise of all the days to come. When they finally broke apart, the sun was fully above the horizon, bathing them in its warm, benevolent light. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and turned her toward the steps of the porch. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go for a walk." He led her down the steps, past the stables where the horses nickered a soft greeting, past the bunkhouse and the blacksmith's shop, and out toward the open range. They left the world of buildings and fences behind them, walking side by side into the vast, sun-drenched prairie. The wild grasses swayed around them, and the sky above was a boundless dome of blue. The future, like the landscape before them, was vast and unknown. It would hold hardships, droughts, and winter storms. There would be losses and struggles, for that was the nature of life. But they would face it all together. The cynical, solitary rancher and the disgraced, outcast orphan had found in each other the one thing neither had ever expected: a home, not of timber and stone, but of the heart, hand in hand. They walked into the morning, their shadows stretching long behind them. Two small figures made infinitely strong by a love as resilient and untamed as the wild, beautiful land itself. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with our audience, so please leave a comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Like this video, and give your support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.